Hey guys, welcome back to the Battleship Yamato build. Finally, we're getting around to the main gun show with the main 18-inch gun turrets, 46 centimeters. So I went ahead and I've cut the main parts off the sprue already. And so, I know we've already looked at the gun barrels in the first episode where we started looking at these guns. There is a seam line on both sides you're going to have to clean up if you're going to use the plastic barrel, but I'm using the metal ones. These are your options per the instructions. You can either use this barrel extension, and again the plastic has a notch so it only goes in a certain way. So this is what you're going to use if you're not going to use the blast bag. And then this is the blast bag that they provide you. And it looks like that, and then that just glues onto the face of the turret like so. If you're using, if you're not going to use the blast bag, then this is going to have some mounting pieces that go in here like that. So blast bags, let's take a look. I would say that this is probably the weakest part of the kit, and the reason I say that is just look how smooth this is. There's a pretty good seam line. I've already started to clean up here, but you can see it. It's very pronounced. I haven't touched this side yet. So what I've done with this other blast bag is I've just taken my hobby knife and I've scraped in some detail on the side, and it doesn't, I don't know, it's not great by any means, but it's better, I think, than having a smooth surface. At least this alludes to the fact that there's some extra material that expands when the gun goes off. So that's what I've done with that. The blast bags for the 15.5 centimeter guns, that I went ahead and I built those off camera, and I'm waiting to glue these after I'm done painting. And I'll put a picture up if you don't remember what the blast bag from the kit looked like. But I've used Magic Sculpt to add material here, and again I've scraped in some of the folds and creases on the side, and I think that looks a lot better, and also it fills in that space completely, which matches the reference photos. So I think that looks a little bit more realistic than what the kit provided as far as blast bags go for those guns. Real quick before we dive into building this, here are the instructions. This is where it explains everything that I just explained. You have the option for blast bags or no blast bags. And the cool thing is it gives you all the photo etch parts for doing them without blast bags. And in fact, in the instructions, this is the only mention of using the blast bags. So I think it's obviously going to look a lot cooler and have a lot more detail having them without the blast bags. But I am going to use at least two, and the reason for that is if we look at Anatomy of the Ship, the reference, this is the last known photograph of Battleship Yamato on the day that it was sunk. And you can see in the photograph it's under attack. So right here, if we take a close look at turret number 1, we clearly see there's a blast bag on the far right turret. The middle and left don't have one. Turret 2, it looks like there's one in the middle, and it looks like turrets on the left and right, the barrels on the left and right do not have a blast bag, and then turret 3 is completely obscured, so we really have no idea. 6 months prior, we can see that it had all three on all three of the turrets. So since I'm modeling this one closer to the last day it was in service, I'm gonna go with at least this for turret 1 and 2. And since we don't know what turret number 3 looks like, or looked like I should say, then I'm gonna go without the blast bags on turret 3 altogether. So we're really gonna only have the 2. I think that'll give us some visual interest and showing the difference between having the blast bags, not blast bags, but the guns are gonna look a lot cooler without, and most of the barrels are gonna have no blast bags. So these are the only two. These are only two blast bag parts that I'm going to be using, which also save me a good bit of time on improving the detail on those two, and the rest will be without. So I'm going to go ahead and get all my parts cut off the sprue and ready to go, and we'll start putting these together. Back in a sec. Alright guys, I'm just about ready to start putting these together. Real quick, the blast bags. So I asked for some advice on the Scale Hanger 182 Discord, and my buddy Tim suggested wrapping it in some kind of fabric to give it texture. And ultimately that's what these were lacking. Since they're so smooth, they really just need some texture. I don't necessarily need to carve in all of like the creases and stuff like that, which is really time consuming. So I think these look pretty good. So I've already done up a few. I just wanted to show you how I'm doing that. This is just some like gauze tape. I've got a piece ready to go here. And so I'm just starting on the bottom of it. It's because this is where I want my seam line to be, because you're not going to see this port right here. So I'll just start right about here. Just kind of place that in there. And then I'm wrapping it onto the one side like that. And then right here is where I'm going to start trimming away some excess material, because otherwise it's going to start sticking to itself and getting kind of messy. So this is a new blade, so it's pretty sharp. We're just going to go right along the edge of where it's going to mount into the gun. Trying to be careful not to cut myself. I've slipped a couple of times and been lucky so far. Alright. Alright, so now we're going to continue wrapping it over the top. And this stuff stretches too. So if you want, if you're going to come up short, it looks like you can make it stretch a little bit. And we're just going to trim it away on the back side. Just like that. Okay, now that we're wrapped around to the other side, I can see I have all this extra, so I'll do myself a favor and go ahead and remove what I know I'm not going to need. What? I'm okay. Thought I got myself there for a second. Alright, so yeah, it looks like I come up short just a little bit here. So I'm going to pull it back. I'm going to pull on it tight and wrap it up. Let's see, now we're meeting right there. That's alright, because that's going to be on the inside where it attaches anyway. Alright, so there we've come together right here at the end where the barrel is going to meet. So we're just going to go along just like this. Trim away all this extra. Alright, there we go. That's the blast bag covered. Just test fit it onto a turret. That looks good. That detail with the bolts and rivets right there are still visible, so it's not too thick. And we'll just kind of dry fit a barrel on it. There, and I think that's going to look pretty good. So I'm still going to do a mixture of some barrels with blast bags and some without. I think I'm just going to try to stay true to what I saw in our reference photo with the front two only having one blast bag each, and I think that third turret, since we don't know what it had on there, I'll go ahead and I'll put 2 blast bags on that one, and the rest of them will be uncovered. Alright, so let me get set up over here. We'll start putting these together. Back in a sec.
Alright guys, that's going to do it for this video. If you liked it, you know what to do. The next video is going to be the last video on this video series. We're going to do a full build video and roll out finished model. Hope you guys enjoyed it, and I'll see you next one. Bye guys.